So with the new Tyranid combos, nids have been seeing some newfound success, though one unit in particular really stands out as an auto-include, and perhaps one that people are going to dread seeing on the other side of the table. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about the sheer power of Tyranid Hive Guard, with a bit of an overview on the unit. We'll take a look at their datasheet, a few obvious combos with them, how much damage these lumbering artillery machines can do, and how I think about using them in-game. In the lore, these guys are basically Tyranid defense organisms, usually deployed in the latter stages of invasion to protect spore chimneys, their entire function essentially to be a walking gun turret, their six-leg stance being good support for their impaler cannon, which they can use to uncannily target foes that they can't even see, due to a telepathic link between themselves and their telepathic shard beasts that inhabit their living ammunition. In-game, this basically allows them to fire at things out of line of sight, basically acting as artillery that can target anything that they want within range, and your opponent can't do anything about it. In general, Games Workshop's tended to be quite careful with artillery units in 9th edition, usually pricing them with a fairly high points cost for the amount of damage that they do, because being able to target exactly what you want is really quite powerful, particularly in 9th where there's so much additional cover. I think when an artillery unit like this gets really good, it can be a bit of a grind to play against, as some armies just might have very little or no counterplay that they can do against the Hive Guard. They're just going to be sat back, safe in a ground floor ruin, doling out the hurt with those impaler cannons all game long, and many armies are just going to have to weather the storm, at least until the last few stages of the game. Can be a bit of a grind for opponents, but to be honest it's not really the worst thing in Tyranids, who haven't been doing all that well for the first part of this edition. Giving them a few of their own really quite strong tools is pretty nice. It's nice to see them genuinely competing with the top tier armies again. In any case, let's take a look at what these walking weapon beasts can do. So Hive Guard are an elite's choice for Codex Tyranids. They usually cost 35 points a model, but I'd argue that the optimal loadout is most certainly the Impaler Cannon, which is an extra 10 points each, 45 points per model, or 270 points for a commonly seen unit of 6. Profile-wise, for the points cost, they're not enormously exciting, I'd say. A movement of 5 inches, weapon skill 4+, ballistic skill 3+, strength 4, toughness 5, 3 wounds, 2 attacks, leadership 7, and a 4+ armor save. The ballistic skill 3+ is quite nice within the Tyranid army. Quite a lot of the gun bogs only hit on a 4+, which does hold them back a bit when you get -1s to hit going. They're not going to be doing a fat lot of damage in combat, and defensively they're kind of okay, though if you can target them directly, 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ save isn't really particularly stand out for 45 points. Weapons wise, they can either take the shot cannon or the impaler cannon. I'll talk about the shot cannon first because I really don't think it's quite as good these days. A 24-inch range gun with assault D3, strength 7, AP -1 and damage D3, with a bonus effect if he happens to target vehicles, where if you roll a 4+ to wound, the target suffers 1 mortal wound, or it suffers D3 mortal wounds if you roll a wound roll of a 6. I don't think it's terrible, it's an okay general purpose weapon. The blast rule could make it quite efficient against anything with 6 or more models in it, and the vehicle thing will pile a few wounds on enemy vehicles whenever you fire at them. Perhaps the relatively short range does have the potential to hold them back a little bit, at least with their relatively slow move characteristic of 5. In any case, it's okay, but for optimised Tyranid list, I'd certainly be wanting to look at those impalers. The impaler cannon is a 36-inch range weapon with heavy 2, so you are going to want to be stationary, strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3. The weapon can target units that aren't visible to the bearer, and on top of that, the enemy units don't gain any benefit from cover to their armor saves, and that's pretty helpful for dealing with anything with good armor saves, when AP -2 might struggle against some things, say like marines in cover. For an artillery type weapon, I think it's just a really nice generalist profile. Strength 8 means it's going to be useful against virtually anything that you point it at. Most of the toughest things should still be wounded on 4s. AP -2 means that even heavily armoured things can't just completely ignore this, and damage D3 is good against multi-wounds. Whether you fire them at infantry, hordes or heavies, they are at least going to have some impact. The 36-inch range is a potential weakness, though I think far less in 9th edition than it was in 8th. If you have a ruin just somewhere midway within your own deployment zone, that should be able to cover a fair amount of the table. Perhaps one of the most important things with setting them up is to make sure they've got range to places where enemy units are going to need to be. Particularly if you've got range to enemy home field objectives, that could make things very easy for at least you having targets to clear off them. I think overall the damage profile for the points isn't enormously impressive, but Tyranids just have some of the best shooting buffs in the game, weirdly enough, and can very easily get double or even triple the amount of firepower that you'd normally be able to get out of the unit, as we'll see in a second. Finally, in terms of other options and special rules, you can take things like toxin sacs or adrenal glands if you want to, though there's not really much point if they're not going to be mixed up in combat. And like the other non-synapse Tyranids, they do suffer from instinctive behaviour. They're kind of an important one to be able to keep within synapse range, as they're usually going to get that -1 to hit, as if they're hiding out of line of sight, they won't have any closest visible enemy units, so any target they choose would incur that penalty. I guess that could allow them to move a bit without further penalty though, as in 9th edition modifiers cap at -1. Overall, just at base they're pretty solid ignores line of sight gun turrets, and one of the best places to put Tyranid shooting buffs, particularly some of the nice new ones that they got from the Warzone Octarius book. So next let's talk about the buffs and synergy that you can use with the Hive Guard, and then see how much damage one unit can do with a few of these layered. First up we have the Hive Fleets. To be honest, on their raw stats alone, and being able to double shoot if needed, I think they can be usable in just about any Hive Fleet, but in terms of actually making them more efficient, Kronos and Leviathan both seem to have the edge over many others. Kronos get to reroll hit rolls of 1 when they're stationary, which Hive Guard will usually want to be anyway because they're heavy, and they usually won't need to move because of their ignores line of sight thing, so that's pretty much a flat shooting buff there. And if you happen to have a Tyranid Psyker nearby, you can use their Symbiostorm power. That one's a fairly easy to cast one that gives exploding 6s, so every hit roll of a 6 that the Hive Guard get will score 1 additional hit. Just between those two alone, you're already looking at a good 40% extra damage out of the squad. The other really good one I'd say is Leviathan. Their 6-up Feel No Pain should certainly help if they're near Synapse. That should help keep them safe from any ignores line of sight shooting that the enemy have. But out of the many options that Leviathan gained from the new book, perhaps 3 of them are particularly useful for these guys. There's that Swarm Leader Warlord trait that allows them 4 rerolls to hit like a Chapter Master does. With a 3+ ballistic skill, that should mean that they're hitting the vast majority of their shots. A 1 command point stratagem for exploding 6s similar to Symbiostorm, and a Warlord trait to allow them to redeploy if they need to either stay safe or get range on certain units that they need to. Finally, I think perhaps also worth mentioning are Jormungandr. That one gives your units light cover if they're not advancing, and if they happen to be behind a terrain piece rather than in it, that could be handy for getting them a tiny bit more protection. I think Leviathan and Kronos are the stronger ones though. For 1 CP, you can potentially upgrade one of the units to Adaptive Physiology, and perhaps the most interesting ones out of these are Dynamic Camouflage and Enhanced Resistance. Both of those are fairly decent durability buffs just for 1 CP. Dynamic Camo gives you +1 to any armor saves when you're receiving the benefit of cover. Might be a nice one if you know that you're playing on tables where you're going to be able to set them up in cover, and Enhanced Resistance allows them to treat any AP-1 or AP-2 attacks as AP0 instead. That one's particularly strong against anything that ignores line of sight, as most of the ignores line of sight things tend to be relatively low AP. I think both of them are quite good to be honest. Maybe Enhanced Resistance slightly wins over the camo in my opinion, though I could see arguments for the camo. Character-wise, I think they're going to want to have synapse from something. They don't really want to be shooting at -1 to hit, so even keeping something like some cheap Tyranid warriors nearby might not be the worst idea. I guess it kind of depends on what other big bugs are around. You could potentially cast Catalyst on them for the 5+ Feel No Pain, though I think that'd usually be better served on units that can take direct damage and aren't hidden. I guess unless your opponent's packing tons of artillery, and whoever wins the artillery fight is going to win the game. Venomthropes or Malanthropes could give them a -1 to hit if they're around, though I can't say I've really seen them taken all that much in stronger lists recently. But I think the real winners in terms of characters and unit buffs for the Hive Guard are all these Synaptic Link abilities from Warzone Octarius. The Tyranid Warrior one for +1 to hit is just really cheap and effective. Why wouldn't you want your Hive Guard all hitting on 2s? They could get light or dense cover from the Broodlord if they needed a bit of extra protection potentially. Again, might be better on more directly targetable units though. And then both the Maliceptor and the Turvagon both have really quite nice shooting buffs. The Maliceptor gets extra AP on 6s and rerolling damage rolls, both of which are useful. And the Turvagon allows you to reroll wound rerolls of a 1 or a 2. I would say of those, the Turvagon's buff is quite a bit better, but that's assuming that you're actually running a Turvagon in the first place, and they often seem to be a bit overshadowed these days. Out of the boost, I think the +1 to hit from Tyranid Warriors might be the best bet. It just seems very hard to go wrong with that if you're not using it elsewhere. Finally, and probably the most important shooting buff of them all, is the single-minded annihilation stratagem for 2 CP to shoot again. Being able to fire twice with any unit is really quite powerful. 2 command points could well be worth it, and in a Tyranid list with some units with some decent shooting bite, this is almost a no-brainer to use a few times. It's particularly potent when you have one squad that can already be layered with several of these other buffs, meaning that you can double whatever damage you already had. I think it's this stratagem that makes them a little bit more oppressive compared with virtually any other artillery option. You can just get some murderous point and delete damage out of them with this. Speaking of which, I thought it would be interesting just to take a quick look at their numbers. Say for example, if you're running a unit of 6 of them with impaler cannons, for 270 points you get to delete around about 7 guardsmen, around 3 space marines, or 7 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. It's not an absolute ton of damage points wise, but it will bear in mind that you usually do pay a premium for anything that can ignore line of sight. Just their raw stats do seem to favour them being best against vehicles in terms of getting the most out of their damage output. Just for one potential shooting combo, it's pretty easy to imagine one unit getting the full rerolls from the Leviathan Warlord trait, plus 1 command point for exploding 6s to hit, and then 2 CP for shooting twice. 3 command points ploughing into damage, but it really gets some good results. They'll hit almost every shot with exploding 6s, and 2 CP then doubles the damage after that. On average you shred around about 22 guardsmen, 10 space marines, or do 23 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles. Basically, if the opponent has one big unit or a couple of small units within range, these guys should have a very decent chance of removing it, and it's just incredibly intimidating to have that kind of threat on the table, knowing that the Hive Guard just potentially have the ability to point and delete at whatever unit they choose. So how to get the most out of these murderous gun turrets then? Firstly, in squad sizes I'd usually go for squads of 5 or 6. I think often people will want to flesh out to the full 6 for once. A lot of the time people tend to avoid going past 5 just because of coherency rules and being more vulnerable to blast weapons, but I think you really want every single Hive Guard that you can get into the unit to get the most use out of that stratagem and all the buffs. Against a lot of armies they won't be targetable, so the blast thing doesn't matter quite as much perhaps. Deployment is likely to be the biggest decision you're going to make for them, as usually they're not going to want to move once they're down, and in general anywhere that blocks line of sight is going to be prime real estate for these guys. If you have to make tough decisions about who gets to be hidden out of line of sight and who doesn't, then these guys I think are a very good candidate to. Then provided they can be hidden, they want to have range on the important enemy units, particularly enemy home objectives will be very nice to have within that 36-inch bubble, while also deciding just how easy it's going to be for the enemy to charge you. Hopefully the rest of the Tyranid army can move to screen the Hive Guard and stop them getting locked up in combat, which is perhaps one of their biggest weaknesses. Maybe to aid that you could use that 1 inch from ruined walls trick, the one that makes enemy charges a little bit trickier if they approach from one angle. I did talk about that recently in the movement tips and tricks video I released the other day. Finally, they ideally want to be within synapse range and within range of any buffing units or characters that you might have for them. It's going to be more relevant on them than most. From there it's going to be a game of target priority. You kind of have free reign for what you want to pile on a whole bunch of wounds against each turn, and it kind of gives the Hive Guard player the absolute power of what they want to target and what's going to lead to victory if it goes down. Some of the time that might be enemy direct damage dealers, some of the time that might be objective holding units, and denying enemy victory points by gunning them off primaries. If you're investing the command points and double shooting, I think that early in the game is usually going to be a good idea to do that. The more bigger swings that you can get early, the more it means that your opponent's not going to be able to damage you in later turns. Overall, Hive Guard are just a monstrously powerful unit, and if you don't have any good way to counter them, then they're likely to rack up really quite a big body count over the course of the game. I think the first unit that you include will be the most valuable, and then maybe slightly diminishing returns after that, as of course the first unit that you use would get all the best choice of buffs and stratagems. Still though, with how solid they are, and depending on how prevalent the terrain's going to be, I think you could certainly spring for a second unit, or even more in some lists. I can imagine an 18 Hive Guard list being an absolute slog to play against. Counters wise, they do have a few obvious things that they're going to struggle with. Other indirect fire might well cause them problems, particularly if you can outrange them. Incredibly fast movers to help tie them up, maybe things like fast moving Drakari charging out of transports. If you can lock them up for a turn, you're likely going to save a unit or two of yours. Maybe outranging them for a turn, or maybe using things like fast moving flyers to get line of sight on them and do some hefty damage to the unit. Otherwise it's just going to be a case of sucking up, taking the damage, hopefully focusing on the rest of the Tyranid army and trying to win the mission while they delete unit after unit. Perhaps a fairly painful way to play the game, but might be a better option than sacrificing too many of your units to their guns too early. Anyway, let me know what you think of the Hive Guard. Have you played with them or against them? I look forward to hearing your feedback down in the comments. They do seem to be monstrously scary on paper, and they have appeared in a few powerful lists recently. Hopefully we'll cover some Tyranid lists on the channel in the near future. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.